Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is part one of a series focusing on compliance policy in Intune, which of course is a component of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. So as we get started, just want to call out, and hopefully I won't make this mistake as I go along, compliance policy is sometimes you'll hear people interchange it with compliance profile or call configuration profiles actually configuration policies. The point is there's actually two nodes in the Intune console. One of them is compliance policy. One of them is configuration profiles. The two are different, are really different. Configuration profiles are all about putting configurations on the device. Compliance policy is all about assessment, right? So also, if you look at compliance policy, you will see that it looks fairly simple, and it is, right? So this session, this is part one. I don't know how many parts we'll have, but this will definitely not be a longer series because compliance policy is a smaller section of Intune, and sometimes it's thought of maybe as being or I'm assuming maybe it's looked at and you think maybe this isn't as big of a deal as configuration profiles, but let me just encourage you to take a closer look and pay attention here. Compliance policy is a big deal in a number of ways, and it does have its complexities to it, as we'll talk about as we go through. So here's our agenda. Just want to talk about what compliance policies are, why we care, and I'm going to do a walkthrough. This is an overview session. I'm not going into any detail. I want to introduce the topic, and then in future sessions, I'll go into detail in a couple of areas that I'll talk about. No troubleshooting to really get into. I will have a couple of tips and tricks as we get near the end, and then we'll wrap up. So what are these things called compliance policies? Well, really, they're rules and they're settings that can be used to assess a device. Now, notice I didn't say configure a device. Compliance policy is all about asking the question, is this device compliant with my corporate requirements in order to let it do certain things, right? Now, that assessment, again, really, really important. So compliance policies assess compliance, but again, they don't configure anything, but the result of that assessment is going to flag the device generally as compliant or not compliant. There are a couple of other things that might show you in there that I'll talk about in a minute. One of them being this thing called in grace period. But generally speaking, you're going to have a device either in compliance or not in compliance, right? Now, why do we care about this? So compliance policies work with Azure AD in a couple of ways. One of the key ways that you can use these is using conditional access, which is an Azure AD kind of piece, security piece. So conditional access, this is where compliance policies really stand up. Now, you don't have to use conditional access with compliance policies. Don't hear me say that you do. But you can use compliance policies with conditional access as a way of assessing whether a device is able to gain access to your resources. So what is conditional access? Well, conditional access, and we'll do at some point a session just on conditional access because it's got a number of places to tools and levers you can pull to help make decisions about accessing your environment. But conditional access helps protect organizational data by requiring users and devices to meet certain requirements. One of those requirements could be having a device that is compliant, right? So device compliance assessments absolutely play in as a critical component, not the only component, but a critical component of conditional access, right? If a user's device is not compliant, they don't get into certain parts of the environment. If a user's device is compliant, then they can get access. So, little tangent here for a minute. Historically, we've thought about security in corporate environments as kind of two silos. The device is external to CorpNet, so therefore it's not secure. We have to do VPNs, firewalls, things like that. Or a device is inside corporate networks, so it's trusted, it's secure because it's on-prem, right? And obviously there's a lot of sub discussions with those, so not trying to be exhaustive in that discussion. But now we live in a world where you've heard the phrase zero trust computing, where we don't know that you're using a secure device. And so we have to do certain things beyond firewall, beyond anti-malware, beyond all of the traditional security measures to make sure that when you're connecting to corporate resources, you're doing so in a way that is secure. Even if the device is not, being able to make sure that we have assessments and controls over access in all these scenarios, right? Again, zero trust computing, huge discussion, but just touching on it there. Another component is config manager integration. Now, this is specifically for Windows computers. So what you're going to find out is, as we look at the console in just a minute, that the list of compliance policies is not huge. And so it doesn't take a long time to grasp around these different options. But one of the things that's unique in the Windows environment with Config Manager is one of the settings you'll see in Intune in just a minute basically says, hey, stop, when you're assessing compliance, stop and ask Config Manager what it thinks about compliance. So if you turn, and we'll do a session on that. When you turn that on, then as we're doing the assessment, Intune's going to ask Config Manager, hey, here's this device. I'm trying to figure out compliance. What do you think about it? Right? And so if you have certain compliance rules configured in your environment in Config Manager, then Config Manager compliance detail can be factored in and joined with what Intune thinks about it. Again, I'll briefly show you that in just a minute, not digging into any detail in this session. All right, so what are the requirements for compliance policy? Not very many, right? Certainly you need Intune for deploying these compliance policies, Azure AD Premium for doing things like this, one of the supported platforms, which are any of the supported platforms, and you need to have your device enrolled. So I call that out because in some scenarios that we talk about with Intune, specifically Microsoft Application Management at Protection, right? There are scenarios where you don't actually have to have your device enrolled in Intune in order to manage applications, as an example, on the device. Here, we're looking for compliance of the entire device, and so to do that, your device does need to be enrolled in Intune. So all that said is a precursor. Let's get to the fun stuff and just walk through this real quick. I'm going to pull in the Intune console, or actually, I said that wrong, habits, Microsoft Endpoint Manager Admin Center, and go through this. So the first place I'm going to start is on this device's overview page. And so here on the right-hand side are different sub-menus that we can go look at for an overview, one of which being compliance state. So here we have device compliance status, where you can kind of see across all your devices the 4 statuses that you might have. Typically compliant, not compliant, or not evaluated. Oops, sorry. Compliant, not evaluated, not compliant. You do have this setting in grace period, which I'll talk about in just a minute, a little bit more, just to give you some context around that. Scrolling down, we see devices without ... What that means is devices without compliance policy. So none in my lab, right? And then setting compliance. So these are the different settings. Again, this is my lab, so not exciting, but some setting compliance that we can give you in a dashboard view for the devices that are in your environment. And then device protection status. What the status is for the device. Is it needing a full scan, needing a restart, different things, right? So that's kind of our reporting overview. Now, one of the things you can also do is look at compliance specifically on a device if you want to. There's some of these that will let you drill in to them, but for some reason, my mouse, I think, is causing me grief today. Anyway, one of the ways you can also go look at it is to go look specifically at your devices. So I'm going to go up and look at my I don't know, let's do Windows devices, whatever. And I can see right alongside here that I do see a compliance result. Now, this particular lab, not related to this session at all, but one of the things that I've done is I've brought forward my config manager managed devices through something called tenant attach in config manager. And that's what you're seeing is this device is managed by config manager, not managed by Intune at all. And so that's why under compliance, it says see config manager in this case. But if we know the status, or if the device is managed just by Intune, then we'll know the status of the compliance scan. We'll display it for you, right? And we'll go on down and here's another one not compliant. Here's in grace period. So you actually see this status showing up for a machine. Again, we'll see what that means in just a minute. But you can look at devices too to get that level of understanding about what's going on. Sometimes you'll also see an error status for compliance, and that just means we've encountered something that causes problems as we're trying to evaluate compliance. But typically, it's going to be compliant, not compliant, or maybe unknown, right, at the time. So anyway, you can see that. Now, let's go and actually go back to, or go into the compliance policy section here. So you see, so I'm in the devices. I'm going to go back here, right? Because you can see the compliance policy and configuration profiles here. These are the two distinct sections I talked about at the beginning. So I'm going to go into compliance policies, and I want to look at the various configurations here. Before I get here, though, I'm going to call out. Notice that there are default compliance policies for each of the OSs. The only OS that we don't have default compliance policy for specifically is Mac OS, right? But the other ones we do. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. I want to start with compliance policy settings. So compliance policy settings are settings that every single device enrolled in Intune will process. And the way they process them, the way you configure them, can have implications. And there's not very many, there's 3 of them. And so specifically, mark devices with no compliance policy assigned as compliant or not compliant. Not compliant is the default. So what that simply means is if you have let me explain it this way. When we first introduced Intune, we had the ability, well, I say first, I don't remember when we first introduced Intune, but when we first introduced compliance policy, I should say, we had the ability to configure compliance policy, but there was no, as I recall, no default compliance policy. And so sometimes you would see devices and it would come back and say, not compliant. Well, how can it be not compliant? There is no compliance policy. The way it could be not compliant is because of this setting here. Mark devices with no compliance policy assigned as compliant, non-compliant. Obviously, this has an impact on how your device is processed, what your device is allowed to do. There's another, so make sure this is set appropriately, make sure you understand what's going on. Enhanced jailbreak detection. So that's what it says, right? That, and you can always click on the bubble about what it means, right? But whether or not you want to allow enhanced jailbreak detection, and then compliance status validity period. So this one is basically here, right? And so if you have a device that in this time period doesn't check back in, we give it the configured amount of days, 30 days before we start to call it non-compliant. Guess what another name for this is? This is your setting for in grace period, right? This is where we will pull this particular setting, all right? And we'll talk more about that in grace period again a little bit later. All right, so that's the first section because all of the devices that are monitored for compliance go through this, right? Or that are enrolled in Intune go through these checks. Now, let's go back up to the top and look at our policies. So we'll just use the default policies that are configured. I can show you if we create policy, we select platform. Here are the ones for Mac OS. I can go create that and just roll forward. click Next. And so here you see that we have some settings for macOS, but I'm going to go back and look at the ones that are configured by default as our guide. So here's compliance policies. I'm going to start with Windows. Windows 10 default compliance policy. Go open that up, look at properties. All right. So here are my compliance settings. If I edit that, then I have this group of five different categories that I can look at. So first is device health. Windows Health Attestation Service is what plays here. Whether I want to require BitLocker, Secure Boot, Code Integrity, those are not configured by default. Also device properties, those are things like minimum and maximum OS health or OS version, any particular OS builds, and so on. And then this one, unique to Windows, is where we will call out from Intune to Configuration Manager to assess compliance. So this is not configured by default, but let me pull in Config Manager and show you what I'm talking about. Again, I'm not going to do hardly anything here because we're going to do a session on this as we go along. But let me go into here. So we have, if you see, I'm under compliance settings, and we go down to compliance policy, right? So specifically, this is where I will go configure policies related to compliance. I can go create one. Not going to give it a valid name, or I don't care about the name. Here, it's going to have to be a device that is managed with the Config Manager client. Click Next. I choose my platform, so I'll choose Windows 10. And then I need to create a rule. So I'm going to click New, and then right up here, I need to choose what my condition is. So include configure baselines in compliance policy assessments right here. Right? And there's some other ones here, but this is the one that I care about. And that's where I'll stop, and we'll come back here whenever we get to the session where I want to show tying this in between Config Manager and Intune. So for now, let me go ahead and back out of this, cancel it because I don't care. Whatever, get rid of it. All right, fine. So let's get Config Manager out of the way, right? So that's Config Manager. There's other settings here. System security. We can go through and decide what our password lengths are going to be, encryption status, device security, Defender settings. Here's Defender ATP, right? These are for Windows devices. Now, let's go look at iOS as an example. And so if I go back to configuration policies, here's iOS. I can go look at my defaults. And I have the same categories except for one, right? Well, actually, these are different categories. Email, whether I want or how I want to deal with email. The setting unable to set up email on the device, not configured or require, right? Device health, how I want to deal with jailbroken or detect jailbroken, or require the device to be at or under the device threat level. That's an Apple thing, right? Device properties here, minimum, maximum OS version. And then finally, system security, where we go back through passwords and some different things about it, right? Restricted apps and device security, so on. So you can see, some similar categories, but differences between settings that are applied per device. And then go to Android Enterprise. So this one is interesting. So Android does have device admin configurations, but it also has enterprise. So device admin has been deprecated by Google, so I'm not going to go into that. But enterprise is where we can see some settings here. Right. So Microsoft Defender ATP settings there, device health settings, whether the device is rooted, some Google Play protection settings, device properties again, minimum, maximum OS version. And then finally, system security, some encryption, passwords, different things like that. So that is the sum total of our compliance policy settings. And you can decide what you want within that. And again, not super complex, pretty easy to get your mind around, but really important things to make sure that you have configured well and understand and applied to your environment, right? Now, another thing that I want to show you is, well, what, frankly, do you do with this? So let's say you set all this up, and now you apply it to your devices or users, right? And you start to get back results, and you see some that say non-compliant. Well, what do you do with that? Well, there's a couple of things. The first one is under the notifications section, and so here we can go create a notification email that is sent to your users on a device that is non-compliant. One of the other things that you can do, which I talked about, but I didn't go deeply into, I'm not going to go deeply into here, is you can use compliance status as a condition for conditional access, right? So just very briefly, because I intend to do a session on conditional access, if I go create a new policy, then one of the conditions that I can assess is device state. So I can say configure it and exclude devices marked as compliant, right? Now there's a whole lot about conditional access, how you set it up. You can see some different scenarios, but that's one place. Now another thing you can do in conditional access is go into the locations node, and this is Android specific, where you can use locations to assess conditions, and so, assess your compliance, non-compliant status, which would be applied here, right? So I just highlight locations to talk about that, but the actual compliance, non-compliance assessment will be done here, right? So again, we'll talk about conditional access more as we go along. All right, so back to my devices and back into compliance policies. So we had our notifications. We can send an email. We can use our compliance status in conditional access as examples. Now, here's a place where we can actually, if we want to, retire non-compliant devices. Now, I don't have any in my view, but I could, right? And then a section here where I can define locations. Now, this is Android specific, but this is where I mentioned the location can be used in some cases to define whether a device is compliant, not compliant, right? So an example, if you only want your devices to be able to connect to your environment whenever they are in a location that is known to be in the US, as an example, versus being in EMEA somewhere, right? Then you can define that. No problem. You can set that up all day long pretty easily, okay? Now, so this is all about setting up compliance policy to determine compliance, to start to take action on compliance. But how does the device actually learn about these settings, start to apply these settings, continually evaluate these settings? Well, I'll talk about that more in a minute. But one thing I want to show you is some of the ways that users can interact with this through the company portal. So every device type has a company portal available to it. I'm going to use the company portal that's available on the web and just go to portal.manage there. And this is my company portal as it's on the web. Pick my account, log in. All right. And so the company portal comes up. Now, what I can do, there's several things I can do here, but specifically what I want to do is look at the user's ability to interact with conditional access or with compliance policy. So let's say that right now the user has a device that is not compliant, and they want to make sure it is compliant because they need to be able to use that device to do certain things. And if it's not compliant, conditional access will block them from doing it. That's the scenario. So I can go look at my devices, all of the devices that I own as a user. I can either click here, or I can come up in the menu and click devices, takes me to the same page. And I will see a list of all of the devices that I, as the user, own. And I can see their status, right? Device category unknown. I can see some warnings that are out here, different things. And so I can click into any one of them, right? I'll click into one and I can see the detail and so on. If I know that my device is non-compliant, this one is compliant, can access company resources, but say it says not compliant, cannot access company resources, whatever, I can check status, and then that will initiate effectively a policy cycle that, along with that policy cycle, I will be able to reevaluate my compliance, right, on the device. So that's kind of how that works. All right, so let's pull the console out of here. Now, in terms of some tips and tricks as we start to wrap up, the first thing is compliance policies, being able to deploy those. So you can deploy compliance policies to both users and devices, right? Meaning that you can deploy to user groups and device groups. It's up to you how you do that. Just know that if you deploy compliance policy to a group of users, then every device that user or a given user owns will be subject to the compliance policies that you've deployed. So you just saw in the company portal, for me, my user account, I have 5 devices. So if you were to deploy a compliance policy to me, then that compliance policy would be translated to all 5 of my devices, right? Now, another thing that I've mentioned is that you can return a status of in grace period for a device. You saw one of them flagged as in grace period for status under compliance. What does that mean? How does that get controlled? So if you have a grace period assigned to the device, if you do not have a grace period assigned to the device, and if the device is non-compliant according to your settings, then the status will be returned non-compliant. If you do have a grace period assigned to the device, but that grace period is expired and the device is not compliant, then non-compliant will be returned as a status for that device. If you do have a grace period assigned and that grace period is not expired, not expired, then compliance policy will refer to being in grace period as you saw, right? Okay, device check-in. So device check-in is what I was referring to when I talked about the company portal, how the user can check their status. It will initiate a check-in, right? And part of that check-in will be evaluating compliance. So there's several ways that you can initiate device check-in. If you have just enrolled your device, then for a small period of time, and I can't remember what it is on the device, I think it's up to 30 minutes or maybe up to an hour, I think it's 30 minutes, that within that 30 minutes, the device will check in very frequently. And the frequency of the check-in is dependent on the device, an Android, an iOS, or Windows device. But for that first 30 minutes, it checks in very frequently. And so things are moving and we're checking settings and applying different things and so on. After that initial time period has expired, then we'll check in on a routine cycle. And again, this varies based on the device, 8 hours for some, 6 hours for others, right? And then also, you can always manually check in. I showed you in the company portal. You can go through Windows devices in the settings node and do a check-in that way and so on, right? But bottom line, there's various ways to do a check-in. You can even go into the Intune console for a device and select sync, which will cause the Intune service to tell the device, come and check in, right? And so you as the administrator can trigger the sync if you would like. All right. In terms of multiple compliance policies, what happens? So if we have multiple compliance policies assigned, then the one that has the highest level of security required will be the one that is applied. Same thing is true if we have a compliance policy conflict. That conflict might arise, for example, if you have some settings applied through configuration profiles and some settings applied through compliance policies, then compliance policy will win and the one with the highest level of security will win, right? And so again, that's pretty much it. The point of this session was to go through an introduction. What's next is going to be, and I haven't fully decided as I'm recording this, but looking at these policies. I may do that all in one session. I know I'm going to do one on Config Manager tied in with Windows devices to compliance, and I may do one more, haven't decided. Again, not going to be a real long series, but definitely want to cover this because it is really important. And so with that, we'll wrap up here and plan to see you next time.